Hey guys, so I want to talk a little bit about the Charlie Kirk thing. Well, specifically the Charlie Kirk assassination slash execution, um, whatever you feel inclined to call it. It's been a very interesting couple of days because I've spoken to a number of people, friends of mine from across the aisle, people who are left leaning, people who are right leaning, and opinions on Kirk are split. You know, it's diverse, it's varied, and I can say he's a very polarizing figure. But I have realized there are two main sentiments when it comes to Charlie Kirk. One, he deserved it and absolutely um, absolutely deserved the fate that came upon him. And then two, he is a good man fighting a just war, or a good fight who got cut down in his prime. So I I think it's opened up a very interesting conversation in my head for me to wonder about, and it's the conversation of how we approach the legacies of complex, flawed people. In some cases, complex, bad people who were touched by greatness in some aspects of their life. I am not judging um, the Kirk situation. I will say my opinion on it at the very end. But I'm just talking about how people who others might judge to be bad or complex or polarizing, how we can pass through their legacies. Um, and I remember reading a bit about Socrates, his execution, because I found it so interesting. I wondered, why was Socrates executed? What was the reason behind society, Greek society, choosing to kill this orator, this thinker who just seemed to ask interesting questions, you know? And ultimately, I found out Socrates was killed for impiety, um, trying to corrupt the youth, and refusing to worship the gods at the time. As you might imagine, these don't look so important to us today. But I imagine that in that scenario, in that time, during that time, and in that climate, it seemed like quite a big deal that Socrates was seen to be corrupting the youth, was seen to be refusing to worship the gods of the time. And I then wonder, should it be, is it morally permissible then to execute people? Execute people for their views. I am not talking about how destructive their views might be or how non-destructive it might be, because while we might think it's quite objective, to some it is subjective, quotes and unquote. So, for instance, Socrates was killed for something the people in those periods thought to be objectively bad. But I would judge that that was subjective, and I wouldn't judge it to be even bad for that matter, because Socrates was someone who was asking questions. Now, do do we get who then holds the rights? Who then holds the authority to kill and execute people based on the opinions that they have, even if those opinions are destructive, even if those opinions are causing active harm? I think it's an interesting conversation for us to weigh and look into, because we've seen as part of historical figures, great men, frankly, Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, some of them in positions of real power, but great men nonetheless, who tried to make an impact with their words, their opinions, their views, who were cut down um, as they tried to live their life. And no doubt the people who made these decisions to kill these people felt justified. However, I'm not of the opinion that this is the right approach, but because I understand that even though it might temporarily shut down the conversation, it's a slippery slope, and soon the tides almost inevitably turn, and so the people championing your own causes become the victims of this monster we are allowing and creating. And it's all opened up a conversation for me, just how free is freedom of speech. I've looked into some of the things Mr. Kirk has said, and truly I feel some of them are very deplorable. As someone from a Christian background, I did understand why he would say some of those things, but I still disagreed with them nonetheless. Ideas like, basically insinuating black people couldn't be capable pilots, or that, gay people should face some kind of persecution. I've never quite agreed with that, but I grew up in a Christian environment, and I understand it when I understand the words they are saying, but I don't agree with the logic or the conclusion they've come to. And that was the case with Charlie for me, Mr. Kirk for me. I understood the words he was saying. I didn't agree with the conclusion or the thought processes or the logic that allowed him to get to that point. So as far as it goes, I saw a problem with his perspective. I saw a problem with his views. But I'm also someone who, you know, I value the concept of free speech. I come from a part of the world where sometimes it's easy to silence people who don't have voices or don't have a platform or don't have the reach to make decisions and say things in a public forum that could impact the culture you exist in. So I understand the need for free speech because it gives people voices and we get to interact with ideas of those kinds. But at the same time, there is the question of how absolute or how free should freedom of speech be? Do we just get a pass to say everything and anything in the name of free speech? Or do we reasonably put barriers, just like we reasonably put barriers in place when other rights are exercised? What makes freedom of speech unique and different to such a point where we have to put a situation in place where it doesn't have a cap or it doesn't have a barrier? For instance, you have freedom of movement, yeah, but your freedom of movement can take you into someone else's living room unauthorized. It doesn't supersede their right to privacy. So I would imagine then your freedom of speech could face some people's rights and situations where it's not allowed to supersede it. So I think this in itself is a real problem to the argument of people exercising free speech and saying um, quote and unquote hateful things in ways that harm or direct harm towards other people. So, long story short, I don't believe the concept of absolute freedom of speech is possible to practice in reality or even conceptually, because when we imagine the rights, we always imagine limits to these rights, given other people's rights existing and overlapping in those situations, you know. So it's been an interesting conversation, but ultimately it's opened the door for me to evaluate the legacies of great people we look into. Charlie notably had a problem with Martin Luther King's legacy. Martin Luther King was a civil rights leader, and he did a lot to advance the cause of minorities in the US. However, it would be a fool's errand in a way to pretend he didn't have his own issues, to pretend he wasn't a deeply flawed man. And that's what this video is meant to inquire about. It feels more like a question in a sense. How do we look at the legacies of deeply flawed people? In some cases, people we judge to be evil, people we judge to be destructive, manipulative. How do we evaluate their legacies in a way that embraces the truth of whatever they were trying to accomplish, whatever lives they led as humans and as people who walked the earth, you know? It's a very interesting conversation. I mean, today we see Socrates as this genius philosopher, this thinker who pushed boundaries. But the Greeks didn't think so, you know. King was hated by lots of people, including the US FBI. Now, I want to believe a lot of Americans, including lots of FBI agents, celebrate King. How would we look back on Charlie Kirk in 60 years, in 70 years? To be clear, I don't believe Kirk is King. He is no Martin Luther King Jr. And I believe Kirk has said so many things I don't want to be associated with. Not I believe, I know he said things I don't want to be associated with, things that are very um, careless, and seem to perpetuate the system that he ultimately fell victim of. But at the same time, he was a father to some, a brother to some. If you were a Christian, he was a role model. You know, he was somebody people looked up to, in as much as the other side of the spectrum hated him. So it's interesting, and it's a question I'm genuinely asking. How should we pass through? How should we explore? How should we look into the legacies of people who are supposedly great, supposedly, and yet who might have had a darker side to them? I think whatever we think about Kirk, very few would argue that he had, or would argue with the premise or the idea that he had a potential for greatness in a way that American youth movement doesn't often see, American politics doesn't often see, and he had it. Whether or not he used it for good or for evil, it's not the contention of this part of the video. It's that he had the potential to be great, and to have that cut and taken away somewhat feels like a real tragedy. And I do feel some empathy for a man publicly executed, even though I deeply, deeply, deeply disagree with a lot of the things he said. So just let me know, how should we look at the legacies of complex people like Kirk, like, say, an R. Kelly, like a Trump, you know, the sort of people who might have made a positive impact but have a dark cloud or a shadow or a dark side, to them. Just how free should freedom of speech be? Just how free should we be allowed to say our opinions? Just how much should we say before we are held accountable for saying words that affect the people around us? Who gets to decide to hold someone accountable? Should it be done extrajudicially to the cheering of the crowd, or should it be done in a court of law? And then how do we regulate the powers of a government if we allow them decide what we should and should not say? Because those powers could very easily be abused in the future if we choose to take a stance that the government disagrees with. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you.